This is ICUJP. Good morning, everybody who's here and who is watching on the recording of this meeting. We're very grateful for everybody who's joining us in any manner. ICUJP has been at this work for over 23 years. We have stood strong uh, regardless of who is president of the United States or the leader of any other country, and we intend to keep doing that. We were founded on the principle that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. Those were the words conceived of at the earliest meeting of ICUJP, convened by Reverend George Regas of blessed memory. Well, welcome everybody to ICUJP. The invitation that brings you here today electronically had within it a donation button. We rely on the kindness of friends and strangers and new friends. So anything you can donate, be as generous as you can. We are a small, struggling group, and we depend on you to meet our expenses each month, to keep the doors open, to keep the Zoom on, and to do our work. This is also a time for ICUJP announcements. Please save the date of January 11, a Saturday. Tragically, this is our next in the ongoing Close Guantanamo rallies. We've been at this for decades to close that abominable prison. There's great fear in the hands of President Trump what Guantanamo may look like. So please, in Los Angeles on the West Side Federal Building grounds, join us. You'll see flyers soon with the exact time, the speakers. We're indebted to John Crampner, who organizes this every year. And we hope this will be an extraordinary turnout to demonstrate that we continue our commitment to close Guantanamo. I want to save as much time for our reflection and our speaker. So my reaction to Tuesday's re-election of Donald Trump is to quote John Lewis, an amazing figure in the history of civil rights and justice more broadly. John Lewis said, "Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part." I was with two of my grandchildren the night of the election this year, and being with them and contacting my other two grandchildren and my children just reignited my commitment to the work of ICUJP, the work of our partners, and the work of people like our guest today. So in that spirit, I'm turning to Chris Ponette for his reflection.
Good morning once again. I have a little cold, so my voice sounds a little strange. But I did take a COVID test and it looks like I'm negative. But I'd like to put this in the context of what happened Tuesday night. And I really am becoming, since then, a belief that we need to create circles of listening as many of our colleagues watch trauma happen in front of their eyes, with the hope that a woman of color would be elected president, and to watch what happened. And I said to the Catholic worker on Wednesday night, we really, as a trauma chaplain, I put this reflection in the context of it's real easy for us to want to say real quickly, we'll get over this, we'll live through this. We know it's, your wife is in a better place, or your baby is an angel in heaven, or your something good will come of this. And some of those might be truism down the road, but I do think we need to give each other some moments, days, to really reflect on what happened and what we experienced. It's the secondary trauma of people that work in a hospital, and it's the secondary trauma that people in war not only experience sometimes the first wave of trauma, but also the second. So my reflection is, I hope that we create spaces where people can talk about what am I feeling, and without any judgment of whether it's my sibling that is ecstatic about what happened, or whether it's my grandniece that works in a hospital and feels like the world is coming down and is going to affect her, or whether it's when I said to the cardinal the other day, what are the bishops going to do when the deportations start? We have to have a plan, let alone this, when Ukraine, we can go down the line in Gaza and Palestine, abandoning completely Palestinians, all those things that are going to happen. So I'd like to just use Pax Christi's vow of nonviolence as a point of reference for my brief reflection. And this is the core of what Pax Christi is about, in which people take a vow to live differently. And it's among Christians, so it uses the word Jesus at times. Recognizing the violence in my own heart, yet trusting in the goodness and mercy of God. I vow for 1 year to practice nonviolence, who taught us in Jesus the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. You have learned that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In this way, you will be daughters and children of God. And then the vow moves to the actual call. I vow to carry out in my life by striving for peace within myself and seeking to be a peacemaker, by refusing to retaliate in the face of provocation and violence, by persevering the nonviolence, both of tongue and of heart, by living conscientiously and simply, so that I may not deprive others of the means to live, by actively resisting evil and working nonviolently to abolish war and the causes of war from my heart and from the face of the earth. God, in trusting in your sustaining love, and that I believe that just as you gave me the grace and desire to offer it, so you would bestow abundant grace for me to fulfill that. And we can translate that into most of our spiritual traditions, in which we take first a moment to recognize that there was some anger on Tuesday night, and there was some frustration on Tuesday night, and there was the frustration we had before, how could this happen? And how could 50% of the population vote for this person? And how did they not hear what he was saying when he said those cruel things to women and people of color and veterans? How could they not hear? And how can they not believe that just because maybe some of them wanted to have a better paycheck or more stability, that the effect of his mind and desire and now policy will affect so many other people. And so how do I take on that spiritual place in which I'm not going to react to that with violence of mind, heart, or actions, but I'm going to hold up a higher sense of values? And how do I love Donald Trump, my enemy, if that is true for you? How do I love my brother or cousin or whoever else who thinks that this is amazing and great days lie ahead? How do I love those people that are going to implement these extensions of the death penalty, extensions of border violence, separation of children? How can I love those who are going to say, sorry, Ukraine, you're on your own. Sorry, Palestine, you're on your own. So I just invite us in our own spiritual way to allow these days for us to help create, like what we do at the hospital, at the bedside of the patient. Our role is not to convert or bring them to Jesus or whatever. It's how do I walk in and say to the person, I'm here to hear you. What are you feeling? What is your experience? And to be taken into weird and strange places. You got shot Tuesday night, but all you're concerned about is your cat at home. You have diabetes and your life is not doing well and you're on dialysis, but all you can care about is your church that you love and who's going to take on the leadership. So on these days after Tuesday, I pray that we use these moments, whether it's one-on-one, on Zoom or social media. How do we create safe places that people know that we're not going to be violent in our response, and that we're going to create that safe place? It's one of the reasons that I continue to be inspired by ICUJP, that we are committed, and to say the churches, including my own and others who have been proponents of violence throughout history, that we have another way, a different way, a nonviolent way. So may this reflection give you a sense of peace today. And I'd like to just end with, this has been going around on social media for a while. I don't know where the source is. Keep fighting for the good. Keep showing up. Keep loving. Keep giving back. Keep being kind. Keep being brave. Keep caring. Keep trying new things. Keep showing grace. Keep on. This world needs you to believe in the good. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chris, so
Chris,
so
that
much.
was wonderful. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, really, really
One
powerful.
heartening thing,
Thank
Chris.
you.
You said 50% of the population. It's actually not that. About a third of voters voted for Trump. A third of voters voted for Kamala Harris, and a third didn't vote. And I think one of our challenges going forward is how do we activate that third? You can imagine inspiring and activating them could make a huge difference. But we're so grateful for the spirit of your remarks today, Chris. And I will now turn back to you, Chris, to introduce our speaker.
So when we were talking about speakers several months ago, and I suggested Greg and Ken, I didn't know what was going to happen since then in many of our lives, but especially in Ken. Ken is a colleague and a member of Pache Bene board. He is a professor of peace, justice, and conflict resolution at DePaul University. He has some of our podcasts and other things on Pache Bene. He's been an amazing leader globally around nonviolence in East Timor and Iraq and other places, and was a partner with many of us during our movement against the wars in Central America and El Salvador. I really am beginning to believe that those of us who were part of Wednesday morning coalitions during the war in El Salvador, that we will probably, or I will need to be on a regular basis on the streets against this presidency that will, as I say, will be coming after my patients, the people that I live with daily, the immigrants, the incarcerated, the victims of violence, the veterans. You just go down the list of all those people. And so I know I'm in the mode of fasting biblically and wondering where the civil disobedience will start. But Ken has been one of those amazing teachers, an example of that. But what changed was I was looking at the LA Catholic Agitator, and in a small little corner, it recognized that Ken and I don't know how many other 8 or 10 of you went to Gaza and stood there in a nonviolent manner. And all through the summer during these months with the terrible war in the Middle East, as it has expanded, my heart was saying I needed to be there, or why were we not there by the hundreds and thousands? So I was touched by your action, Ken, with several of other Pax Christi friends. And so you are one of those prophets in our world, and we invite you to reflect with us this morning. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. To learn that you have been at it in lots of ways, but including in this circle for 23 years, is very moving. It is not just a witness. It's not just a prayer or study circle. It is a nonviolent action, what you're doing, and it feeds other nonviolent actions like what Chris just mentioned, maybe in the offing. Very grateful to be with you all, and especially this week. And I just wanted to say that we're at a crossroads. Just like 9/11 was a crossroads. We're standing at a crossroads. And some of us have been at different crossroads at different times. And this is a monumental one. And so in light of these events this week, and in light of the intentions that I've heard so far in our gathering, I want to offer several elements of reflection. First would just to share a little bit about my own journey and how I got to nonviolence and how I got to this circle, really, a long journey to this very moment. And then Chris mentioned that I was in Palestine. We were at the edge of Gaza. We couldn't get into Gaza, but we were at the edge there. And I want to share what turned out for me, in spite of everything you read. I was in the middle of what I would call a nonviolence training for the time I was there. And I want to share with you about that because we hardly ever hear that side of things. Then I was thinking about these events this week, and it took me back to an experience I had about 30 years ago where 40 Latin American and North American activists gathered in the hills above Santa Cruz. I heard one of us from Santa Cruz today, where we reflected and compared notes. And I heard an amazing story from 2 Chileans, and it reminded me of what we might be facing here and what we can learn from them. And finally, in light of the fact that we are interfaith communities united for justice and peace here, I want to just share, if we have enough time. I've been part for the last 10 years trying to get my own religious community, Roman Catholicism, to embrace Jesus's nonviolence and to make that integral to the life of the church. in the way that Father Chris lives it. But I'd love to see that with 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. So if we have time, I'd like to share a little bit about the effort that Pax Christi International has been doing and that I've been part of. But let me just start by saying a little bit about my own journey. I went to the University of San Diego. I majored in history and English. I'm originally from Seattle, Washington. And in my senior year, I had a religious experience. I felt like I was on my way to the San Diego Zoo, just some Sunday morning, and I was walking along, and it was as if every step I took was deeper into the arms of God. And I hadn't expected that. It wasn't something I was particularly religious growing up, but I had a profound experience of being embraced by the love of God in a deep and powerful way. And then I made the mistake of taking 4 religious studies courses at once. And that totally blew my mind. One of them was on liberation theology. And so I shifted from any idea, some vague ideas of becoming a lawyer or a history professor or something like that, and decided to study theology at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And I got there, I started my studies, I was really excited about it. And then I met these crazy, wacky people who were taking Jesus seriously when he said, love your enemies, put down your sword, become peacemakers. I said, I've never heard any of all my schooling were in Catholic schools. I never heard anything like this. And it got me thinking about it. I ended up going on a trip. I was working for doing a work study student at the Center for Ethics and Social Policy at the GTU. And we started a book project on the economic, psychological, medical, environmental, political consequences of the arms race. This was in 1980 or so. And even if a nuclear weapon is never physically used again, it's like we're in a nuclear war. And so I went back east to do all this study on this, went to universities, went to think tanks. Every place I went was just more and more depressing. No one could imagine getting rid of these weapons of mass destruction and a whole new approach for our world. I wasn't that political at the time, but I knew that was off base. So when I got to Manhattan, I pulled out of my pocket a phone number for Daniel Berrigan. Some of you may know him. He was a Catholic rabble rouser in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I ended up going to his funeral in 2016 because I was just so moved by his life. Anyway, I pulled out this phone number. I called him up. I said, Dan, you don't know me, but I'm having a spiritual crisis about nuclear weapons. Can I come talk to you? And he invited me up to his apartment in the upper wilds of Manhattan. And folks, it's almost like you go to the Himalayas and you crawl up to the mountain, you go to the cave with the guru, and you get a whole spiritual tradition transmitted in 3 hours. And it was like that. And he just like laid it out. We're living in a culture of death. So you got to decide where you're going to stand. And finally, at the end, I said, well, Dan, I'm going back to the West Coast. And this was a guy who was facing 10 years in federal prison because he had just been convicted of that action that he and several other people did, hammering on a nose cone of a nuclear weapon. And I said, Dan, I'm going back to the West Coast. What can I do for you? He just stared me in the eye and said, don't do anything for me. Find some people you can pray with and march with. And I said to myself, you got this all wrong. I'm the academic, you're the activist. I'm the academic, you're the activist. But that phrase, find some people you can pray with and march with, just like you all have done that, kept going through my brain. And finally, some people were going to go out and protest at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, not far from Berkeley, that's designed 50% of the US nuclear arsenal. And they were going to do a newfangled thing I'd never heard of, a nonviolence training. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do this. I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to go to the thing. And just about halfway through, I was like blown away. And there was a guy there, Terry Messman. I don't know if you ever ran into him. Terry Messman was an activist in Montana, but before he was an activist, he was a journalist. And he was sent by his paper out to Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, intercontinental ballistic missile base, where a Lutheran minister by himself was going to cross the line with a cross on Easter Sunday and risk arrest. So Terry goes out there as a reporter. He's just taking his notes, and he's so moved by this guy facing whatever he's going to face. He dropped his notepad, he crossed the line, and he sat down next to this Lutheran minister. They got 6 months in federal prison for this, simply walking across this line. And now he was out of prison and he was in seminary, and he was giving this amazing talk. And I was going, wow, this spoke so deeply to my heart and my spirit. So I decided to go with them on Monday, the following Monday, and risk arrest for the first time in my life. And I got there and there was no Terry. And I said, what? He talks the talk, but doesn't walk the walk. Oh, okay. I'm not here for Terry. I'm here for the children of the world that have a gun to their head. And so I sat down dutifully in this nice little quiet circle of ministers and seminarians. And we were arrested. We were taken to a holding cell. And about 45 minutes later, they dragged Terry in, because what Terry had done is that he had gone over the fence, gone over to one of the main buildings. There was a stairwell on the outside. He gets to the top. He tries the door. Top secret nuclear facility. By the way, Congress will hold a hearing about this later. How did this guy do this? He opened the door. He walked in. There were all these nuclear printouts on the table. He goes over, starts picking them up, going to the door and tossing them, going back, tossing them. After about 15 minutes, somebody looks up from their desk and says, I don't think you're supposed to be here. And at which point a sheriff bursts in with a gun drawn, drags Terry out, saying the Our Father at the top of his lungs. He comes into our cell. He's dragged into his cell. He tells us all of this. Everyone else is ticked off at him because they're going to get higher charges because they're connected with this guy. I didn't know anything about that. I wasn't political. I didn't know anything about solidarity. I didn't know anything about movements, but I was moved. I was moved very, very deeply. And that began 2 years. I put my graduate program on the shelf. We just did one wacky nonviolent action after another. And then one time I got a letter in the mail. And I don't know how they got my name or address. This was from a man in Nicaragua. And it said, Dear Ken. And he told me about all the destruction my government was doing to his country, and the thousands of people who'd been killed, and the trauma and all of it. And I said to myself, well, I've heard about this before. I've seen Noam Chomsky. But then he got like the 5th paragraph, and it says, we're telling you now, so 10 years from now, you cannot say you did not know. Do everything in your power to stop this catastrophe. And I said to myself, well, what can I do? Then I looked up, and it was as if this was my first real second religious experience. The man was standing in front of me holding a dying child. And then that image disappeared. And then I said, well, what can I do? One person. What can one person do? And then I remembered reading in Sojourner magazine that 50 people had gathered at Kirkridge Retreat Center and said, this was when the U.S. was thinking about invading Nicaragua. if that happens, we're going to proceed to the border between Honduras and Nicaragua. We're trying to get in the way of the invasion. And if that's not possible, we're going to go to federal buildings across the United States and engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. And that came back to me, and I thought, oh, so I sat down and I wrote a little pledge for myself that if the U.S. invaded Nicaragua or escalated its military intervention, I would engage in nonviolent civil disobedience or legal protest. And then I started just sharing that around. I was living in Berkeley at that time, so around the Bay Area. Interestingly, people weren't interested because they said, well, the government is going, anybody who writes something like that, it's just going to be arrested by the government immediately. They're going to be harassed by the government. Nobody's going to sign a pledge like that. So I heard this from one Central America organization after another. And finally I go, well, I guess that idea is not so great. But then the great Quaker, David Hartsoe, called me up and said, I hear you've got this idea about a pledge. And I go, yeah. So we sat down for an hour and a half. David told me every reason why it wouldn't work. And then at the end, he says, you know what? We got to start a movement. I did not know anything about organizing. And that was the beginning of this weird, crazy journey of nonviolence. And for those of you who were part of that movement in the 80s, I commend you. Something like 100,000 of us took that pledge without the internet. There was no Twitter in those days. And 20,000 of us risked arrest. And we learned from people within the Reagan administration that they decided not to engage in an invasion of Nicaragua because people in this movement had told them that there would be resistance, and 1,000 of us had got arrested at a certain action. And that was enough for the Reagan administration. They decided to go with Oliver North and go underground and all of that, which also blew up in their face later. I learned that we have more power than we think through this process. I learned that we have more power than we think. And I saw it in real time. I ended up spending about 10 years of my life in that particular movement. And without going into all the details on that, I learned that we have more power than we think, and I learned something about nonviolence. And it led me to studying nonviolence in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. And so I just wanted to say, to me, I'll give you my definition of nonviolence. Nonviolence is a transformative force for fostering justice, peace, and healing, and dignity for all. It is the combination of the rejection of violence with the power of love in action. It deploys its power through many forms of dialogue and engagement, but also through creative conflict. It is a strategy and a way of life for confronting, preventing, defying, disrupting, and creating alternatives to personal, interpersonal, social, international, and global violence. And I've learned through the scholarship of the scholar Michael Nagler about nonviolence that it comes from this word ahimsa, a Sanskrit word, which literally some people say it just means nonviolence, but what it really means is the power unleashed by refusing to do harm. The power that's unleashed by refusing to do harm. And just my final little note about nonviolence is that Barbara Deming, the great civil rights organizer, the late Barbara Deming of blessed memory, talks about the two hands of nonviolence. If you get nothing else out of our presentation today, the two hands of nonviolence. On the one hand, I will not cooperate with your injustice, with your violence, with everything that's being done to destroy, dehumanize, diminish, dominate. And sometimes in my life, I'm doing this, but actually she says, turn this hand down here. I will not cooperate with this injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. And it's the creative tension that it's going to be so important in the next 4 years and so important to get through the 21st century. So we're at a crossroads. And of course, as we heard in the opening, this week's decision by this country promises to be far-ranging and potentially cataclysmic for people in this country and around the world. A forecast of the coming storms was rolled out in plain sight over the last several months. New suffering for millions may lay ahead. The historic challenges of our age, the climate crisis, white supremacy, global poverty, gender inequity, and systemic violence and injustice of all kinds are on track to worsen. And it's precisely at such a moment that such a meeting like we're having is important. You know, Dr. King said, if we realized it well enough, a group this size can change the world. A group this size. He was speaking to about 20 or 30 people. A group this size can change the world. And it's precisely at this moment that the power of active nonviolence is beckoning us. And we at Pace Bene, this little organization, if you get a chance to go look at our website, we're doing a million things. Why? Because we believe that we can build a culture of active, creative, liberating, nonviolent love in action. And we've persistently doubled down on the energy of creative nonviolence that we all possess to oppose the terror of the violence that's already here and that's coming in our lives, our societies, and our world, and to boldly put love into action. This power is good anytime, but it's especially important now. And that's why I'm so grateful that we're meeting. I'm grateful that we're here, that you didn't do something else today, and that you've been doing this for 23 years and hopefully 23 more. So Chris mentioned that in August I went to Palestine, and I want to just share with you a little bit about that journey, if that's okay, which is that's not what I focused on in my work. Although some of my students at DePaul University were very involved in an encampment there in the spring, and I was supporting them in classrooms. We'd open the space, just like we opened the space yesterday, to reflect together on what the meaning of Trump victory is and where we're going. But my focus hasn't really been on Israel-Palestine all these years. I mean, I just knew kind of what you hear. And a friend of mine, Eli McCarthy in Washington, D.C., sent an email around in August saying he was looking for some money to go on a delegation with Christians for Nonviolence to the West Bank. And I wrote back and I said, well, are you still looking for somebody? And it was kind of funny. It's not something I had been really looking for, but there was a moment inside me that said, maybe I should be part of that. So he wrote back and says, we have a slot. And I was able to go. And I just tell you, friends, it was, yes, a huge amount of injustice and violence, and what the settlers are doing and what the government is doing, the Israeli government is doing. It's just so unconscionable. But what most moved me was you had these Palestinian Christians, part of a group called Sabil that you may know about, which means the way, who are for 40 years convinced that the only way through the juggernaut of violence on all sides there, and most of that being, of course, from the Israeli government, supported by my government, is through nonviolence, active, creative, liberating nonviolence. And how did I hear that? Well, we would get in a van and we're crisscrossing the West Bank. And we're going into situations where people are under attack. But in the van, it's like Terry Messman is leading a nonviolence training. This person is not Terry, it's Omar Harmary, who has been part of this for many years. He was giving us a nonviolence training, and I just have to give you just a sense of that. So above the sound of the traffic. So you're in a rattly van crisscrossing the West Bank. And it's just, and there's a lot of traffic, and it says, above the sound of the traffic, we were told that active nonviolence. Now, this is okay in maybe Berkeley, but to hear this in the West Bank, it's really moving. We were told that active nonviolence is a way of love and justice. It is a path of change that includes refusing to be enemies, being liberated from hate and animosity, shunning revenge and retaliation, pursuing truth by confronting falsehood and deception, championing the oppressed, the poor, the marginalized, resisting violence, pursuing peace and reconciliation, and holding to the idea that all of us can live in peace together, Jews, Christians, Muslims. As one of the activists we met that week put it simply, evil does not defeat evil, only good can do that. And so we went to all these different places. So for example, we went to a place west of Bethlehem where by government policy, these settlers were attempting to pry Palestinians out of the land that they'd lived on forever. And they were joined by combatants for peace, international delegations, and ourselves, but also other Palestinians and Israelis. And it was so powerful to go there knowing that at any second there could be that kind of attack happening. And they were just convinced that nonviolence and relentless persistence were key to this. We got a call at one point saying that settlers were attacking a family of Bedouins. They had been like relentlessly coming and threatening and attacking. And so Omar says, we're going there. So we went and we get out of our van, we walk up this hill. The settlers are over there. The Israeli Defense Force soldiers pull up. What are you doing here? And Omar goes, what is your name? I'm not telling you my name. What are you doing here? No. What is your name? My name is Omar. What is your name? Finally, the guy goes, Daniel. And there was this like flow of infinity between the eyes. There was, I was seeing in real time the training we were getting in the van, like translated right there into this situation. We went one time to go see who somebody called the Palestinian Gandhi, Issa Amro, been written up in the New York Review of Books and the New York Times, but no one can go see him because he's a Palestinian activist Muslim who has been arrested many times and for organizing and for his commitment to nonviolence. So anyway, we get to Hebron and we go to the checkpoint. We go walk up to the soldiers there. They say, come back at 10 p.m. It's 10 a.m. Well, why can't we go in? No, you can't go in. Okay. So then we go to another checkpoint. They say, well, we'll let you in, but the settlers are going to beat you up and then the soldiers are going to beat you up. And Omar said, well, isn't your job to keep them from beating us up? So anyway, we walk back through this beautiful bazaar and so on, and we get back in the van and he's on the phone with Issa. And we're just like driving around and around and around. Finally, we stop and it's sort of in the middle of nowhere. We get out and he says, now we walk. And we're walking up through a Muslim cemetery. Very beautiful, very hallowed, big headstones, Arabic. And we're walking up through the hill. And in the Christian tradition, when Mary Magdalene goes to see Jesus, who's been, killed, he's going to hell, going to the gravesite, the angel says to Mary, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" I felt that come back to me. We're walking up, we're walking. Finally, we get to the top of this hill, a gate opens, and it's Isa. And he invites us in. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here." He says, this was August, nobody's visited me since May because there are all these soldiers on his street, but you found the secret way. So, I think in my original title for this talk, it was the way through no way, which is a quote from Andrew Young from the Civil Rights Movement. Nonviolence is a way through no way. And that felt like that. And we had the most amazing conversation. Started with nonviolence and ended with nonviolence. He says, it's the only answer. It's the only way to be. Unarmed, but powerful resistance. And he'd been jailed and tortured many times. He says, my nonviolence today is trying to help people stay in their homes. We went to visit the families of the hostages. We went to Tel Aviv. And actually that day there was going to be a big demonstration on their behalf. But we were able to go and meet a couple of the people who were working to get the hostages back, because our intention was, first of all, in this journey of nonviolence, was to lament all those who had been abducted and killed, the Israelis, and those who were still being held. Our intention was to lament the now 42,000 men, women, and children who had been killed, to lament the fact that my government has sent so much weaponry there. In other words, the nonviolence is, in this case, is to really be, as I was instructed by people like Omar, we are going to be for everyone. But it means these two hands of nonviolence. I'm not going to cooperate with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. There are many, many stories I could tell you from that experience that line up with that. And I guess the last one I would just share is that you are an interfaith communities, and we had an interfaith service 1 kilometer from the border of Gaza at the near the one of the southern crossings into Gaza. And we had rabbis for human rights. We had a Muslim sheikh. We had other Jews and Christians. And in the middle of some of us speaking, the siren went off. And we were told, either go get into the bomb shelter, which they had, or just lay down. So we did that. We just laid down, and we heard missiles landing, not exactly where we were, but really on the other side of that border. And then after about 10 minutes, we were given the all clear. And I was, of course, the terror of that, and but the fact that we were all there together was some bizarre sort of sign of hope in spite of that violence. And then some of us in our trip, our delegation went down to the border crossing and held some signs saying we were opposing U.S. Weapons and calling for a ceasefire and so forth. So I came away from that and we couldn't go directly into Tel Aviv. We had to fly into Amman, Jordan, and so on. And there's so much more to this trip, actually. But we were able to come back, and I'm grateful that you've opened this space for us to reflect on this relentless attack on Gaza, but also on the West Bank, and the hope that people there have for transforming this situation by resistance, nonviolent resistance. Like I said, there are many other stories I could share, but in the interest of time, I think what I'd like to share finally, given our situation in this country, some of you may know this story, but as I mentioned at the beginning, in 1992 or so, I was part of a group of activists from North America and Latin America that were coming together organized by the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz, to reflect on our situations in both contexts. And in the middle of that, two Chileans stood up, and they told us this amazing story. They said when Augusto Pinochet carried out the coup against Allende in the early 1970s, when the military dictatorship was mowing down the progressive forces, the forces for nonviolent social change and for justice in Chile, a handful of them huddled in a basement someplace and said, what this country needs is a nonviolent revolution. And so they decided to train people for the nonviolent revolution. And they took 2 years to train 80 people in the techniques of nonviolent change that we just so easily maybe talk about, or that I teach about in my classes. But it was against the law, really, to teach these methods of nonviolent discipline, nonviolent strategies, nonviolent people power, which is how all of this works in the end. And then they took another couple years and trained another 120 people. So for the first 4 years, all they did was train 200 people. And then they said, now each of you go out, each one teach one. And by the early 1980s, they were training 30,000 people a year in a relatively small country, 6 or 7 million people, in these techniques of active, creative, liberating nonviolence. And they built a movement. And, Steve, by the end, if I could get privileges to put up some things in the chat, I can share some resources. And one of them is, maybe you've seen it, the Force More Powerful episode on Chile. But what's not told in that is the backstory that I think is the backbone, which is the training. And also what Chris talked about and what I experienced this week with my students, circles of not just listening's important, but also sharing what's really going on with us. And that's what they were doing. And out of that, they found a way out of no way. And Pinochet made the mistake of saying, well, we'll have a plebiscite where you can say yes or no to the dictatorship. And he was quite certain with his terror that he would win. He didn't win, but it was because of ordinary people exercised a movement to make that happen and brought Pinochet down in the end. The final thing I want to just share, since we're some of us out of the religious communities, my own tradition, Catholicism, about 1700 years ago, said violence is okay. And there have been exceptions, Francis and Clare of Assisi, for example, Father Chris, for example. But really, we didn't get trained in nonviolence after that. And so some of us, with the leadership of Pope Francis, said, would it be possible to see an official church teaching on nonviolence and just peace? Now, for some of our traditions, official church teachings don't exist, which I love that. But in the Catholic Church, you get this like official church teaching. You actually have to operationalize it. So that's our theory. Anyway, just to say, we've been at this since 2016. We've held 3 conferences in Rome, 2 of which with the Vatican. We've organized these fat books of theologians, scholars, and practitioners reflecting on the importance and need for nonviolence. And in October, even while I was teaching on Zoom, I was in Rome for a month at a time when the Catholic Church was gathering a big gathering called a synod on the future of the church. And we were organizing seminars for participants in that process on nonviolence. And we launched the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence. And the Pope actually sent us a beautiful message of support. And we had a couple of what are called cardinals in our tradition at the launch, as well as Maria Stephan, who's one of the great authorities on nonviolent strategic resistance. And we got amazing press around the world in the Catholic press, 103 articles in 15 countries and 12 languages, all of which is moving slowly toward, we hope, a growing understanding that, as Pope Francis says, the choice between us now, and this is sharpened this week, the choice is not nonviolence and violence, it's nonviolence or non-existence. And so we're doing our little bit, we hope, to move a tradition that's been very violent in terms of just war, in terms of the doctrine of discovery, the colonialism, all of that. And yet we also believe that there's the potential richness there to actually do, for example, what the Catholics did in the Philippines in 1986, where they brought down the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos through their organizing. All right, so that's a lot. And I really appreciate the chance to be able to share some of these things with you. And I look forward to our conversation now.
Ken, thank you so much. Amazing reflections, amazing life that you've led. We love these autobiographical reflections because we've all had our own paths. We've learned so much in 23 years about the multiplicity of paths and journeys that people take to their present time. I'm going to step on my own line, which I usually save till later, but I'm granting Ken, you are now a card-carrying member of ICUJP. Your membership is current, but I'm equally granting membership to Micheline as a card-carrying member of ICUJP. Please continue to join us every Friday. I actually have a whole series of questions, but I'll mix them in with other people to give everybody a chance. Did you speak with Jews on both sides of that conflict? Did you have any chance to speak to Jewish settlers and Jews who support Israel? And did you have an opportunity to speak with Jews who oppose this war and oppose Netanyahu?
So we met on the first day with a Jewish woman who is opposed to the government's policies. And we also, as I said, we met with the families, or at least at some of the representatives of and some of the family members of the hostages. But it wasn't organized to meet Jews who support the government's policy. So I think that would have been great, but that wasn't the way it was organized.
Yeah, the spirit of my question is in the spirit of your remarks, which is that we've got to find ways to talk to everybody across the spectrum of whatever conflict we're involved in. Let me turn. We've got three hands. Even though we have about 30 minutes, please make your comments and questions brief, and I'm sure Ken will do likewise. Stephen Fisk.
Yes, hi. And thank you, Ken, for coming, and thank you for sharing your wonderful experience, your thoughts, and your knowledge. It's greatly appreciated. What I'm primarily interested in is what your explanation would be for a practical, economic, political, how that would take form in a nonviolent revolution. Of course, we here have been, taught and mentored by Reverend James Lawson, a great nonviolent strategist. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are along the lines of how does it practically work beyond the philosophy and the very high standard of spiritual commitment. How do we reach people on a practical, economic, and political level? And in your travels to Israel, did you connect at all with the Abrahamic reunion people?
Thanks, Steve, for that. So I'm of the belief that the greatest social movement in human history is coming. Why? Because it has to. Because of white supremacy, economic injustice, gender inequity, and all the rest of it, the climate crisis. The greatest social movement in human history is coming. And that will be very important to a culture, an emergent culture toward a nonviolent shift, because it has to, because we don't make it through the 21st century if that shift doesn't happen. Now, I'm going to answer your question this way. So I teach a course called Discover Nonviolent Chicago. And Chicago, of course, has a reputation for being an extremely violent place. But I take students, we spend a week before school even starts. We spend a week going, they're first-year students. We go all over the city, the south side, the west side, the north side, and we meet people who are building facets of a culture of nonviolence. And that's where I put my hope, not some big plan that emerges, but that we, first of all, recognize how that culture of active, creative, just nonviolence is being built in our midst. And then we begin to connect the dots. And that's what I do with my students. And we see this, actually, we begin to see Chicago differently, that there's actually an emergent nonviolent culture going on there. And violence is a kind of aberration. And it's also giving us tools for confronting that violence, whether it's gun violence, whether it's the punitive criminal justice system, whatever it is, police brutality. So that's where, so I always think about it this way, Steve, that I think when we think in too utopian terms about nonviolence, it kind of is used by the domination system against us. So I think it's really better to think, where do I see it already emerging and how can I support that? And when we started Campaign Nonviolence at Bene, which, by the way, this last September, we had over 5,000 actions in the United States and around the world. But it started very small, and we did a training actually. I think Father Chris, you came to it, preparing for that campaign in Southern California. And it was great because we spent a good chunk of time identifying things that are already happening and that we could connect the dots. Is it easy? No. Is it all going to come to fruition, even if it's just everybody getting us the tools of nonviolent change? No. But I think it's really important for us to identify the ways this thing is, as Dorothy Day used to say, it's the new that's coming out of the old. It's the what's being birthed out of the shell of the old. So that's my bet.
Thank you. Folks, take your hand down once you've spoken. Rick Banyalis.
Ken, thank you. I think that over the last couple days, having conversations with folks, I had one yesterday with somebody on the call here that really helped allay my anger. And that's my go-to. That's my neuroses. That's where a lot of my problems have happened in life. But I've been very angry. I especially where I see, you know, the people I grew up with in a neighborhood near East LA, how they, how they voted and how they see their connection with this country. And I'll be honest with you, I've been despondent. I've at times thought that when people mention 1933 Germany as our current point in history, just happening over again. I was, when they talked about it and the previous when this guy was in office before, I thought it was overreaction sometimes. Now I don't. And I think we're going to need to have lessons from people that have really had to deal with stuff like this in the near future, like the people that with Gandhi had to deal with the administration in India and in South Africa, where he was before, and he got kicked out of, as you know. The solidarity movement, because I think workers are going to be run through the mill here, and so I wanted to see if you thought that there were parallels that we can take a look at where we are at right now.
So let me just say, first of all, on anger, it's said that Gandhi called himself the angriest person of the 20th century, and that for him, anger is the fuel of nonviolence.
Mm.
It depends on what kind of vehicle we put the fuel in. And I was with a group of 18 seniors in college who are studying to become agents of change in my program. And they expressed a lot of anger, especially the students of color, especially the trans students, and feeling that this was a vote against them and that this is hatred toward them. And so I'd be the first to say I'm not minimizing in any way what happened this week. We are at the crossroads, maybe the greatest crossroads we've ever faced in the history of this country. As I wrote in my blog a couple of weeks before Trump was left office the first time, I said, he still has the nuclear codes, you know? I mean, and that's just one part of it. But I will say we need to study how dictatorships have been brought down through nonviolence. We do know, and this work of Erica Chenoweth, I don't know if Erica Chenoweth has been in this forum, but at Harvard, who has studied this very question, that nonviolent strategies are twice as effective as violent ones against foreign occupiers and dictators. And that is solace I didn't have when I was a young activist. We didn't have the data then. Now we have the data. There's also the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict that studied authoritarianism around the world and movements and how they can succeed. Some will fail, some will succeed. But in this country, what we've talked about so far, circles, what we used to call affinity groups. This is kind of an affinity group that you have here, but I think it's really important to get with people that have your back, that you can talk about these things, that you can go through what my students yesterday, they went through a whole thing of anger and sadness. There wasn't denial, as Kubler-Ross would say, but actually I was struck in an hour and a half, and I was not telling them what to think. I was just holding the space. They started to come with more hope because they realize the government, Trump, the rest of it, wants us to feel despondent and depressed and out of gas. And so they were teaching me, oh, these tools I've gotten in this major, Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies, those are critically important, and to mobilize them over the next 4 years. So I would just encourage, maybe you're already thinking this way. I believe, as with Dr. King, that a number of people like in this circle right here and the connections we all have, that's the seed of a movement that's so critically important. So critically important. And it's got to be nonviolent, because I could understand the anger and so on bringing us to violent actions, not necessarily in this group, but other people. But that's just going to be used by Trump to accelerate the destruction of what we're trying to build here. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. I want to tell people that in the chat, Rick and Chris have put resources on the Campaign Nonviolence, on Pace Bene, on other websites. Daniel.
Thank you. Ken, thank you for pouring your inspiration into this space this morning. I'm most grateful to have been here among all of you this morning. I'm going to ask, I'll look at all the resources, and Chris and Rick, thank you for putting these things into the chat, and I'll explore them. But you began with a definition of nonviolence after you said about having studied nonviolence from different traditions. And you began, nonviolence is a transformative force. And then I couldn't keep up with what you were saying. So if that's written down anywhere, and it looked like you were reading it from your notes, I would be most grateful if you could share that with all of us, because it forms really a sensibility that we can work with. I'm walking over to this convention later here in Riverside of the whole Episcopal Diocese. This coming weekend, my nonprofit Interfaith Solidarity Network scheduled something called Hope and Gratitude, a gathering for the common good, with the idea that after the election and before Thanksgiving, we might want to come together to, without knowing what the result was going to be, but regardless of the result, there is still all of these aspects of, white supremacy, climate crisis, the immigration oppression that's about to, intensify, economic injustice, all of these things. Interfaith Solidarity Network is based on the principles of nonviolence, but we're not always conscious of that and employ them and engage them. And here we are, right? So thank you for all of that. And I think a starting point is training, that we see that coming out. So if you would share that definition with us in some form or another, would be most grateful. I will not cooperate with your injustice, but I am open to you as a human being. Thank you.
Yes, that's great. So I put a series of resources from this talk in the chat, including a piece that I wrote about my journey to Palestine, but also these definitions of nonviolence. You should be able to see those in the chat. Thank you.
Wow, you are a master of multitasking. Look at these resources, everybody. Whatever your technology is, save them, copy them. Hearing about Thanksgiving, we're going to be planning some programming leading up to Thanksgiving. We want to take a hard look at what does that mean. We will not meet on the Friday after Thanksgiving. It's one of the rare times we don't meet. It's just given people's travel plans and being with family and others. But we're going to take Thanksgiving very seriously this year because I think it's a crucible within which we can begin to do a lot of the work we're talking about. Let's keep going. Phil Way.
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, I've been in shock the last couple of days, but it's also stirred up my brain. I think I'm going to be going through some kind of a major life change as a result of this situation. I feel like I'm on the cusp of it. I have two ideas I want to share and just kind of throw out for reaction. One is I think we have a window of opportunity or a window of necessity to really lean on the Biden administration to stop the support of Israel with money and arms. We might be able to convince people that that there is nothing to lose by getting out of the situation, and there's nothing to gain by staying in it, and that could be a leverage to get into the current administration. The other thing I'm thinking is more broad scale, but could play into this, is that I would like to see us build a coalition of the major peace and justice organizations. Code Pink, CARE, boggling my mind, JVP, etc., and have a brainstorming session with other leaders from these organizations to have a strategy session dealing with this whole crisis that has been thrust on us. So anyway, I'd like to, and just kind of mention in terms of resources for nonviolent action against oppressive forces. You're probably all aware of the book, A Force More Powerful. James Lawson kind of used it as a textbook in his nonviolence seminars. And it's full of both failed and successful ventures into facing oppression at a national, global scale. Anyway, your responses, please.
If that's to me, I would just say that I agree with what you're saying. I think the movement that is required to get this administration or the next one to an embargo on arms, for example, is critically important. And it has to be across the board. It has to be all of us doing that. I'm putting in the chat, in case you are not familiar with it, I found it really helpful. And again, it was somebody I knew back in the 80s who created this, Bill Moyer, the 8 stages of a social movement. Maybe you know that, but I'm putting some resources there. It's been very helpful to understand that movements go through 8 stages, and smack dab in the middle is activist failure, and that every successful social movement goes through that. But I just put that in case that's helpful. But I do think training, organizing, and I just think there's so much wisdom in this circle and the groups you're connected with, having a strategy session that listens and then reflects and shares feelings, but then begins to think through what could we do to get to yes on ending arms, for example, there. So I agree with all of that.
Excellent. Yeah, that is in the chat now. Thank you, Ken. I'd like to turn to Micheline's son.
Oh, hey, thank you so much, Ken. That was really good. That was a lot of stuff there. It's like, wow. Thanks for the shout out for Santa Cruz too.
I love Santa Cruz.
I'm going to the Peace Center right after this. What I'm dealing with after the election is I had a day of mourning, but I got over it really fast. I got these tattoos, Arab tattoos on my arms. One says, action speaks louder than words. And the other arm says, my faith has to be stronger than my fears. So my faith is that it's going to, no matter what, it's just keep doing the work. And, but my kids, my daughter, who's, I think I shared this story after 9/11, she thought the American government was going to come and put Arabs in concentration camps. She's, quarter Arab. And she got that because she was studying what we did to the Japanese during World War II. And then my son, after the Trump election, just recently is really pushing me to move out of the country because he's afraid 2025 project had something in it that said they're going to incarcerate Americans. And, just dealing with the fear with my kids and the fear of people of my son's age. How do you do that? I'd like to see somebody's input about this. My faith is like, I don't have the fear in my heart that my kids do. But how do you approach that with kids that are afraid they're going to be incarcerated, their family's going to be deported just because we're Arabs? It's a fear that I'm dealing with my kids. I'm trying to talk to them, but they get mad at me because I kind of push them off. But I really need to learn how to listen to their fears and not buy into it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know we're on it in terms of time, but I would just say those in some ways are well-founded fears. And given the superheated rhetoric over the last 6 months from the Trump campaign, But there is a great fear that millions of immigrants will be deported. I mean, this is what Trump says he wants to do on day one, and that they could round up activists and so on, the enemy within. But action on one arm about action is better than, see, I think that teaches our kids that we are not immobilized and that there are possibilities. And we know there are psychological studies that show families where parents are taking action for justice and peace. Even if it doesn't get the solution immediately, it's transformative for kids to have that happening. And then our faith, is stronger than our fears. I mean, this is when our faith matters the most, really, is in these kinds of, at these crossroads. So I think you're doing it great, and just listen. And then we need to take, I'm not telling you to take action. I'm just saying we all need to take action and be prepared. And that should be part of the strategy. I think we learned that the Reagan administration backed off an invasion of Nicaragua. They later, the U.S. later invaded Panama and Iraq twice and Afghanistan, but they never invaded Nicaragua directly. And it was because they told us. It's because we had a plan to resist that. And we were already resisting it. So I think I believe in movements. I believe in God, but I believe God works through movements. So, however we can be part of that kind of planning, not just one action, but yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one of my questions, at least with the time we have. Ken, we've had several speakers this year who have urged us to love our enemies. And I don't think they mean love them like I love my wife or my grandchildren. So we have a few minutes. Can you kind of unpack that? Are there different kinds of love? Is the word love thy enemy a substitute for another emotion or approach? So share your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, how would I love Hitler? I would love Hitler by resisting Hitler with every fiber of my being. I would love Hitler by resisting Hitler with every fiber of my being. He is so, the domination system is so deep there in that person that the only way that liberation can happen, which is what love is about, is total nonviolent resistance to that situation. And so, at the same time, it's hard to count people out. And we're not, and I heard my students say, I don't know if I can do that. But I'm always moved by the story of George Wallace. And you may know this story, that, of course, the poster child of Jim Crow, of segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever, the great, exemplum of white supremacy. And as you may know, on the 30th anniversary of Selma, George Wallace comes to the celebration. And he says, I was wrong and you were right. And he asked for forgiveness. Now, some people wanted to forgive him and other people didn't. But I take that little example. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Steve Bannon or Trump or anybody, but I just know there's a spark of divinity in all of us. And I think that movements help. I think that movement called the civil rights movement created the conditions where something that had a grip on this guy loosened a little bit. And that's what I think movements do. They're therapeutic in that way. They can help us go through a therapy as a society for transformation. It's hard to say that this week, given the virulent racism on display. At the same time, that's where I go with this. Love your enemies is resisting their injustice and their evil. But, and this is maybe God's work, that I'm open to you as a human being. But in this very, somebody calls it militant nonviolence or muscular nonviolence. I mean, so that's where I am on that question.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ken, for your wonderful program. And thank you all for being here and being so supportive. I loved your two hands, the one open hand reaching out, because we're told, and I believe, that love wins. And I also like the way you're holding up your other hand saying, no, that's not acceptable. Now, I learned from a Spanish friend, and she said, si te enojas, pierdes. If you get angry, you lose.
Mm.
And I try to remember that. But your hand, holding up your hand to say no, doesn't mean that I have to be angry. I don't have to hold up a fist. I can hold up a no, and I can try to hold up a hand out to reach you. So thank you so very, very much for bringing this to our attention and for all the resources that you provided. And I guess my question would be, what is the mantra that you tell yourself when in a pinch? How did you overcome fear when you were in that truck in Gaza?
That's a good question. I think it was that we were together. I think that sense of connection, and also just taking in the trauma that you're hearing about all the time in a way that's rededicating to a world where you don't want anyone to experience this kind of harm. But I will tell you a story. Do I have time for one story?
Yes.
Please.
Okay, so in those days in the 80s, when I was very involved around nuclear weapons and then Central America, we did an action on Market Street in San Francisco where the Department of Energy office was. And it was, the police were very brutal with us. And I won't go into the details of that, and it could also be triggering to share that with you. But I will say this, when we got to what's called the Hall of Justice, where we were being booked, slammed up against the counter. In those days, they had things called typewriters. I don't know if you remember those. And there was a person at the typewriter, and two officers were inflicting pain on my wrists and hands and fingers, and it was increasing the pain of it. And I said to the officer taking the information, I said, can you ask these officers not to inflict pain on me? And he says, I take information, you give information. You don't give me this information, you're getting this typewriter on your face. And then I felt it. It was really like, almost like they were going to break my wrist or something. And then this is what happened. This did not come out of training, or all of a sudden, I saw these two officers as children.
Mm.
I had this like spontaneous image of them as children. And I turned them around and I said, I love you. With sincerity, not. And they increase the pain a little bit, and then they let go. And I've had a number of experiences, especially in activist experiences like that transformation. Now you could say, well, I'm a white person, I get more privilege that could be the case. That may not have happened with a person of color, but I learned from those experiences that it's possible to see your opponent as a human being. And when we proactively take a step in that direction, something happens.
Wow, that was a really important moment. Thank you, Ken. I'm going to take 2 minutes of our remaining time to call on McGregor Eddy. I was intending to dedicate our meeting to her and her activists, some of whom were arrested yesterday. McGregor, briefly tell us about your action and what inspired you.
Well, this is just a sec. This has actually been planned for a while. This is the protest at Vandenberg Space Force Base when they launch an intercontinental ballistic missile with a dummy hydrogen bomb 4,200 miles and lands in the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, which this country once tested 67 hydrogen bombs that use an atom bomb. So to protest this, we've been planning to go. I've been talking to you guys about it, but we only have very short notice, and they did it on election day. So people were exhausted and distracted, and it was extremely hard to go and be there in the middle of the night, in the middle of the nowhere, in the middle of the week, in the middle of the election results. There were 6 of us. Lynn Hamilton, who was a co-defendant with Dan Ellsberg at the arrests in 2012 when they stopped announcing them. Myself, Sharat Lynn from San Jose, Jan Meslin from Cayucos, Scott Yunt from Livermore. There were 6 of us, 2 men and 4 women, and we tried to send out messages of love to cancel the terrible missile. And the next day we found out that that missile had 3 dummy hydrogen bombs. 3. That's not, they're supposed to, all the ones in the silos have 1. Now, last year in 2023, they did it again. Stratcom, they want to put 3 hydrogen bombs. These are world ending. These are not atomic bombs. So this is what we're protesting. It was even worse than we thought. So there will be some articles and follow-up. I think I sent you a link to Leah's wonderful article. Leah wrote a book, What They Don't Want You to Notice on Election Night. But what I want to share with you is that was an extraordinary place to be to get the news of the new era and the end of the old era. And it's kind of like being in an earthquake with people. These 2 of us were arrested, but they didn't come arrest us. We just walked across the line, and we did it to try to raise the level of publicity. It's just a citation. It's a ticket for trespass. It's not, I don't want to compare it to what the SWAT teams attacking the kids on the campuses or what happens to labor unions. This was, in fact, we decided that we should do it because we're the most privileged. We're retired and our careers can't be damaged. And with the new administration, this could be consequential. So we chose it to be the old ladies with no career. So that's all. Thank you for listening. It was not traumatic, but I felt you were with me and you knew about it. And the next one, they've already announced, will be in February 2025. They don't like these protests. They usually do another one this year. This was the 3rd. I think they're waiting for the new administration for different rules to stop us. That's what I think.
Thank you, McGregor. We don't measure courage here. That was a courageous act for you and your colleagues, and we are grateful to you and them. We've come to the end and beyond our time. Ken, I really want to thank you. I hope you could see the impact you've made on this group and the kind of the impact we made on you today. What are your final words?
Love wins.
Thank you. We're going to keep doing this work. We're going to cause good trouble. And Ken, we are so grateful to you beyond today's program, but every day that you wake up and do this work and putting my joke aside, you are a dear partner to us. And we will look to you for guidance and support, and we will provide you with support in your good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Please be safe over this weekend, and we will see you next week.